Okay.
Okay, so Randy, you're now on camera. I know that frightens you desperately, but I'd like to introduce Randy. Randy has, golly, retired 2 years, 3 years ago now from Arizona Game and Fish.
More like 4 or 5.
Okay, time just kind of slips away once you hit the retirement years. I had the pleasure of working with Randy there. He was well, I guess the titles changed a few different times. He worked out of the Region 6, which is the Mesa office for Arizona Game and Fish, but he really worked all over. And it was delightful to have him because he was the equivalent of what we call a PIO, Public Information Officer. And we had a chance to do lots of educational weekends for teachers, workshops, and such at various game and fish properties all around the state. So he truly is a master naturalist. He's very humble about this, but if I need the encyclopedia of something, Randy is one of my first go-to people because he can get me the answer or get me in tune with the answer very, very quickly. So we're always happy to have Randy whenever we can get him, and we appreciate it that he has given up an evening here after just getting back in town recently. I know he's been to Vietnam mapping herptiles, and he's been to South Africa doing the same. And if you ever have a chance to see this man's nature journals, oh my gosh, they look like they were typeset just fresh off the press. He's a remarkable artist. The taxidermy, at least the ones that used to be in his office, are really spectacular. So, Randy, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I'm going to make you co-host. Give me just a minute here so that you can share your screen. Okay. Okay, so you are now co-host, so you have power.
Okay, let's see if we can get this done here. So let me share screen right there. And let's go here and start the slideshow.
We got it.
Oh, wow. It actually worked this time.
Yes.
There's a novel approach. I'm not sure what to do. So anyway, I was asked to talk about urban wildlife, and in one of my roles with the Game and Fish Department, I dealt a lot with this topic, and we'll just get started because it's a big topic. We got a lot of territory to cover. So people have been around for a long time. And during this time, people have basically taken over the state for all practical purposes. And so if we look at the state population, you can see that more than half of the population in Arizona occurs in Maricopa County, right here in the center of the state. And so a massive urban center that doesn't seem to show any sign of slowing down in growth at all. Arizona's 3 largest cities are all found within the Sonoran Desert, which, as we all know, is a water-challenged ecosystem, 6 to 8 inches of rain annually. And we've got all of these people that we have in Phoenix, Tucson, and Yuma all occur in the Sonoran Desert. And so basically we're looking over 6 million people inhabit one of the driest places in the US. So we look here at the population of the state, and we can see that it is just been climbing steadily over the past several decades. As a matter of fact, I remember as a kid growing up in Chandler, and I'm an old guy now, but it was 8 miles into Mesa on a 2-lane, really crummy paved road, Alma School, that ran north. And Gilbert was a short drive, about 20 minutes over, 15 minutes over to Gilbert from Chandler. And now it's all just one continuous sea of houses. So Arizona is 113 plus square miles, and the 6th largest state in the US by land mass, and is ranked 9th in the nation in growth and 14th by population. So we got about 65 people per square mile. And these statistics are a little bit old, but I mean, they're as current as the last census. So yeah, as you know, that only occurs every periodically. So they're a couple years out. So one of the biggest issues facing Arizona and wildlife managers in the state is habitat fragmentation. And this is a massive, massive issue. And of course, there are natural features like Grand Canyon and rivers and habitat that's inappropriate for species that keep them contained in a regional area. And so those are all natural things, and animals contend with those fairly well. On the other hand, anthropogenic impacts, motorways, urbanization, agriculture, anthropogenic structures like cities, and human activity. So it doesn't have to be a physical barrier. It can just be a lot of people out in the woods or up on a hiking trail or anything like that can have really severe impacts on wildlife and wildlife behavior, and can also impact the way create barriers to movement for wildlife. So here's the problem, basically. Here's the state of Arizona. And, if we look at it like this, it looks like a beautiful place with not much problems or anything. Really, we got a few rivers here. There's a Grand Canyon up in the top of the picture up here. And so, great place to live. And so if we put in the interstates in Arizona, and you can see the state carts getting cut into fragments, sections, and these interstates serve as barriers. And we add secondary roads, and now you can see that it's further fragmented. And then we go further and add the CAP canal, which was a huge barrier that had to be mitigated. Wildlife had to get across this huge canal, and there are overpasses and all kinds of other things, but it was a massive problem getting wildlife from one side to the other. And then we further look at here the proposed I-11, which is coming in here and going to be cutting from Kingman down to basically Nogales area, Tucson. And then we look at the cities and the urban areas here, which are represented by these black dots, and you can see more and more fragmentation occurring. And then we add secondary roads and tertiary roads. And so, there's not a lot of room for wildlife to move around, even in a state with as much public lands and open lands as Arizona. And I must mention that these tertiary roads, this is a pretty crummy map of them, because there's a heck of a lot more of them out there than we see even on this map. And so you begin to get an idea of just how difficult it is for wildlife to range from one mountain range to another, or from one valley to another, or move in any natural manner like they did historically prior to the advent of human beings. So the consequences of habitat are many. And these problems are very, they're dire to the continued existence of wildlife here in the state. So they limit gene pools. They have, when you have animals fragmented, you've got a greater potential for declines in areas, regional areas. The animals can't move out of them, so those populations decline. Animals can't get to new habitats as populations expand. They can't get over to the next mountain range or the next valley or grassland. They can't get back to historic habitat. So if they've been eliminated from a place, recolonization of that is severely handicapped by these roads and other human impacts. It also isolates these populations and causes genetic sinks, and so back up to the genetic or the gene pools. And then we have increased mortality just due to impacts on the road, and these can be really significant roadkill. And matter of fact, even sadly, I must say that some very rare animals, one of the major ways we see them are roadkills, and that otherwise they're so secretive or uncommon, we seldom see them alive. So Phoenix Mountain Parks and are an excellent idea of, or an example of habitat fragmentation. And you can see here that you've got these islands now within the urbanized area, and just basically houses or roads all around these areas. And these islands can support some wildlife, but the type of wildlife they can support is severely limited. So in other words, all these urban areas are devoid of large mammals. You don't have deer in there. The biggest things you have in here are coyotes, and occasionally javelina can persist in these kind of situations. But deer, lions, things like that, they can't make it. There's just not enough room for them to move. And once you isolate animals like this, or places like this, we tend to see a pretty precipitous decline in those larger mammals almost immediate or very quickly following the isolation. And it seems like the genetic sink just catches up with them and they can't maintain populations. So here's, I worked on a project with a friend of mine, Tom Jones, and this is Maricopa Road, Highway 283. And you can see the increase of traffic here over time following these things. And we first started doing this project in the late 1970s. And so this is just a period of that time. And you can see how this traffic picks up. This sharp increase in traffic over here, this coincides with the paving of the road. And so once the road got paved, which is actually right around in here sometime, you can just see it starts going up fairly quickly. And so once that road was paved and it's discovered, it's a major cutoff. Most of us take it if we're going down to Rocky Point or Gila Bend. That's the cutoff road we take. And here's the road mortality of snakes there. And so we look at these things from the period prior to the road being paved here, and we can see that road mortality was fairly insignificant for many species, pretty low, and even low for these. But when we start looking at once the road was paved, or the first 40 miles of it was paved, we can see that these numbers start jumping pretty significantly on some of these species. So, oh, sorry, this keeps jumping around on me. So anyway, we had road mortality nearly double after the in the period after the road was paved, and these are just snakes. And so that doesn't include small mammals, coyotes, larger things like that, or birds or anything along those lines. All right, so how do you get animals safely from one side of the road to the other? And that's a huge problem for not only the Department of Transportation, but the Arizona Game and Fish Department and other conservation agencies. One of the classic examples of efforts that have been pretty successful is Highway 260 leaving Payson and going up to the rim. So going through Christopher Creek and Coles Ranch and all along that stretch of the road going up to the rim. And you can see here on this map here, the numbers of collisions with, these are elk collisions in these areas. And the color identifies, the color identifies hot spots. So in other words, the more collisions you get, the brighter the color. Fewer collisions are green, and then the numerous collisions are red. And by doing this kind of map, the Game and Fish Department and the Department of Transportation could identify major crossing points for these animals and major problem areas that needed to be addressed. So the typical type of structures that were left for animals to cross from one side of the road safely were these box culverts on 260. And obviously this isn't 260. This is another stretch of road in a desert country, but this is a pretty typical thing. And a lot of people think, well, animals can move under the road and from one side to the other. The problem is that a lot of animals won't go into a hole. An elk does not want to go into a box kind of situation like that for fear of predators or being trapped in. They need something that's very wide open where they can see. And so you can't just even though something like this would work well for snakes and tortoises and bobcats and javelina and coyotes, it's not going to work well for deer and elk and pronghorn and animals like that. So there's not a single solution for getting animals from one side of the road to the other. So this is one of the first attempts to get elk across, and it's the one that you see most commonly on 262, but or 260. But notice that these, instead of these box culverts or a sharp-sided bridge, you have these big, wide open, sloping hills here, or that are much more natural to the elk and the deer and the things moving across the road. So they can approach it coming from one side to another, and they can see through it to the other side easily, and they can see it's open and that there are no potential predators hiding up onto the cliffs above them that might jump on them, like a lion or something. So these ended up working fairly well to solve the problem. We still have elk collisions on that road, but we don't have a ton of them. The numbers have really dropped. So you can see here, there was an 84% reduction in the collisions with elk on that road after addressing these problems and putting in these large modified underpasses for our wildlife underpasses. Elk would still rather go over the top of the road if they could, but there's also fencing that funnels them into these underpasses, and it keeps them from running out onto the road in many places. Bighorn sheep are another example of this kind of situation on Highway 83 up there as you're heading in towards Las Vegas. And so here's the typical wash overpass. And you can see, once again, big, wide open thing. Why wouldn't bighorn sheep like that? Elk would like that. Well, bighorn sheep don't want to go under anything. They always go over things. They're mountain animals, or animals that like to travel along ridge lines and mountaintops and the sides of mountains. And going under something where a lion or something could be waiting for them is just not something they are going to do. So even though these underpasses or these overpasses over the washes were intact, and you have these guard railings, which of course don't do anything to really stop an elk from grading over the road, they were going to cross over that road. They were not going to go under these things. So what was built were these sheep overpasses. And so these are bridges basically over the road that are landscaped with natural habitat, rocks and dirt and stuff. There's no plants really on them or anything like that. And it allowed sheep to move from these ridge tops across these overpasses and get to the other side safely. And it was all open above them, but much more natural situation for sheep. And it is reduced significantly the number of impacts. And so these are radio collared sheep in that area. And here's the highway, the black here line. And you can see, how each, I'm going the wrong way, how each animal moves across the road. And you can also see how the road's a barrier. Look at yellow here, how many times it came right up to the road and wouldn't cross it to the other side, except for up here. And then you had other sheep that had less problems, but still, each way you had animals, the road serving as a barrier, that traffic and the structure itself, the animals coming right up to the road and turning around and going back. And so you have animals isolating on this side and animals isolating on this side. And then you have sheep crossing in here in some of these areas, like this green one here, crossing quite a bit. And many of these animals are getting hit. So anyway, this kind of radio collared project allowed the Game and Fish Department to identify the hot spots where animals really wanted to cross, and then put the overpasses in there. And so this is actually a bighorn sheep on one of the overpasses, and you can see it's just like a bridge over it, but it's got dirt and stuff on it. And this was a sheep, I think one of the first ones to cross, a young ram, after the thing was put in. And there's cameras that allow biologists to look at these bridges and see that they're being used, and determine the effectiveness of these overpasses and how they might improve them for the future. So pronghorns on roads. Pronghorns hate highways, and they do really poorly with them. And you can see here how these radio-collared pronghorn are not crossing that highway. They come right up to it, but the red ones, oh, I'm sorry about that. The red ones do not cross over, and the green ones do not cross over I-40 there, or even the railroad tracks there, and along Holbrook there, just out of Holbrook. And so highways are really, really adverse to crossing these anthropogenic structures, even though you can see some of those green ones come right up on top of the railroad track, as do the red dots. And here we see Highway 17, and look at the same phenomena here. You've got red collared, or these red dot animals, these collared pronghorn on the east side of 17, and they are not crossing 17. And same thing with the green and blue ones. We have one green dot that has managed to get there, but for the most part, they're not crossing the roads. So what we found was, through genetic work, that this highway has been in place long enough that genetically the pronghorn on one side of the road were genetically different than the pronghorns on the other side of the road, just being isolated that relatively short period of time. And all you really need is a couple animals every now and then to cross over one side or another and breed, and you keep a very homogeneous genotype in the area. But we've already had these genotypes diverging in a relatively short period of time that this road has been constructed. So these animals, like different than bighorn sheep and elk, have a very different set of requirements for dealing with roads. They cannot, they don't want to cross them. And it doesn't matter that they're open and wide and things like that. The same kind of thing an elk wouldn't hesitate, or bighorn sheep wouldn't hesitate to cross. The pronghorn's not gonna do it all. So one of the things, the impacts of these roads, even secondary roads, can be pretty severe. So you notice in the right-hand corner, there's a couple studies that were done in 1998 and one in 2010, where they were looking at timber rattlesnakes up in the northeastern part of the United States. And they found even little two-track dirt roads that the animals were loath to cross them, and that on one side of the road, the snakes were starting to diverge genetically than the snakes on the other side of the road. So I guess the point is that even though you look at a little dirt road like this and you think, animals are going to cross that without any problem, you don't really know what kind of impacts even the smallest little road or trail might have on the wildlife in the area. So here's a little video of that was conducted out near the Superior area to determine whether people that encountered desert tortoises would pick them up in the wild. And so here you see one of the department people here, and
Okay, she's out.
putting out the decoy tortoise. Desert tortoises have been protected in Arizona since the early 1980s. And here comes the officer to talk to him.
So why did you put this tortoise? I just saw him on the road, and I don't know, I was like, I wanted to keep him. I was playing, I get to take the phone, but I thought it was really neat to try.
So the roads also give people access to areas, and that impacts the wildlife too, in a lot of different ways, from collection to road mortalities to other impacts. So anyway, roads are, habitat fragmentation is one of the greatest issues facing the state, and urbanization, which we're talking about mainly tonight, plays a huge part of that. So when we look back at all of the quality of life surveys here in Arizona, open spaces and access to recreational areas rank right up at the top of the list. They're always like number 2 or 3 on the desirability of living in any particular area. And so, fortunately for us, lots of wildlife can survive in relatively small areas, and these areas don't have to be very elaborate, but the more elaborate, more complex, and more natural they are, the better they are. But they can be a vacant lot next to between 2 houses, or they can be a little back area, neglected area behind a development. They can be almost anything, from parks and things like the Gilbert Water Preserve or the McDowell Orange Preserve or the Phoenix Mountain Preserve, South Mountain, to just the most neglected piece of land that you can imagine. So things like ground squirrels, like this antelope ground squirrel, they do really well in very small confined areas. And as I mentioned before, these wildlands or these set-asides or these natural areas can be almost anything, including golf courses, which are anything but natural, but they provide a lot of habitat opportunities for urban wildlife. And oftentimes golf course ponds, if you visit those, are full of migrating waterfowl, and the greens often have a lot of rabbits and coyotes and ground squirrels and heaven knows what else on there. A lot of raptors nest in the trees around the edges of those things. So any kind of natural, semi-natural area is an attractant for wildlife, and some sort of animal is going to survive there. And it's just a matter of what that animal's requirements are as to whether it's going to be there or not. So pocket mice are in all of these areas, from the vacant lot on up. Most of the holes that you see constructed in those things that people attribute to snakes are constructed by these rodents and kangaroo rats, which also do very well in urban fringe areas and vacant lots and green belts. Pack rats are another one that becomes particularly problematic in urban fringe areas. They build elaborate nests and are infamous for getting under people's car hoods and building nests under the hood or chewing through the wires. They forage in an area about 50 meters around their nest, and they will build a new nest or start a new nest in any structure that is sheltered or secluded where they figure they might be safe. Here's the antelope ground squirrel again. And a lot of people call them chipmunks, but they differ from chipmunks in that they don't have white stripes on their face. Chipmunks have stripes on their face. Ground squirrels do not. Another ground squirrel that's very common in urban situations are round-tailed ground squirrels. But whereas antelope ground squirrels prefer bajadas, so Palo Verde saguaro habitat, lower slopes of mountains and on up the mountains, round-tailed ground squirrels prefer the flats, and they're incredibly heat tolerant. So survival strategy for round-tailed ground squirrels is to be active when it's too hot for any other animal to be out. And they have a really funky kind of inactive period where they disappear at the end of the summer, when they're after the monsoons, when you think there'd be a lot of food for them. They become scarce, and then they pop up later in the winter, and they're out now. The middle part of the winter, they're down again. Kind of very, very interesting animal, but and very, very common. Rock squirrels are another very common urban animal. Matter of fact, where was I? Oh, I was in Bass Pro parking lot, and there was a rock squirrel sitting right next to the freeway there on a rock in the parking lot. And so they don't need, like many of these animals, they don't need a lot of space. They just need some space with some natural resources where they can survive. And they need to learn to stay off the roads, which oftentimes animals do a pretty good job at learning. So in other words, populations that grow up in those areas, they learn to avoid the roads. Although the young ones are often, that's a hard learned lesson. But if they didn't stay off the roads, they couldn't persist in these really heavy trafficked areas. Cottontail rabbits are another extremely abundant animal in these urban areas. and they provide the bulk of the prey for coyotes, urban coyotes, and bobcats. But again, all they need is a vacant lot, a golf course, a green belt, anything like that. They also provide prey for things like urban raptors. Jackrabbits are less common in these urban areas, but they can reach incredible numbers. And so in Chandler, probably about, well, 30 years ago now, right along Arizona Avenue, there was a vacant lot that was about 3 acres in size. And there were about 60 jackrabbits living in that vacant lot. And it was hemmed on all sides, one side by railroad track, the other side by other 3 sides by major roads. Bats are another animal that do well in urban areas. They basically are out of reach for most predators, and people seldom encounter them. They just need places where they can get away and hide and roost during the day. And that's really their only requirement. Urban areas typically have a lot of bugs because there's more water and things like that. So bats often like those. That's a pallid bat. Here's a Western Canyon bat, or what used to be called a pipistrelle. Oftentimes in the evening, when the sun first sets, you'll see a bat flying around, and it's this guy. So they're out when it's still pretty light out, and they live in rock crevices and places like that. California leaf-nosed bat, another bat that's pretty common in the Phoenix area. Matter of fact, there's a big roost right on the north end of Phoenix. And the free-tailed bats, far and away one of the most abundant bats that we have in urban situations. And in fact, the Mexican free-tailed bat or Brazilian free-tailed bat, same thing, are considered to be one of the most abundant mammals in the world, and they form some of the largest colonies of any mammal in the world. So places like Bracken Cave in Texas has 200 million Mexican free-tailed bats using it, and our colonies here in Phoenix probably have several thousand in them. And so this is a bat watching event we held at the Phoenix Flood Control Tunnel on 24th Street and Biltmore. And then there's another one on 40th Street in Camelback. And bats fly out of this flood control tunnel at dusk. And so we just invited a bunch of people to come out and watch the bats exit with us one evening. But you can go there and watch anytime you want. And starting, in about a month or so, the bats will return, and you'll start seeing those numbers increase of those animals exiting. And there's about 5 species of bats that use this tunnel, but mostly Mexican freetails. Ringtails are small carnivorous animals that are found on urban fringes. They're pretty common on places like Camelback and the Phoenix Mountain Preserve and the McDowell Sonoran Preserve. They like any rocky area, but occasionally we get them far in town. Raccoons are the up-and-coming urban nuisance wildlife. When I was young, we never had raccoons, and now they are quite abundant in almost every part of the Phoenix metropolitan area, and that probably speaks to the overall availability of water and food resources that have allowed them to increase and move into these areas. Foxes can also live in really small areas and persist. I saw a road-killed fox at 19th Avenue in the freeway on I-10 there several years ago. And there was just a relatively small vacant lot adjacent to it, but it wasn't too far from the Salt River bed. Gray foxes are really great climbers, and it's not at all uncommon to have them in urban areas. There's actually several gray foxes that are living right near ASU. And when I was working with the department, we got reports from them quite commonly. Coyotes are another animal that do really well, not only in urban areas, but urban fringe areas. They are often the subject of much debate among wildlife biologists. People tend to hate them because they are so smart and they do so well at exploiting any opportunity. So they're quick to grab a cat out of your backyard or a small dog. But the most coyotes I've ever seen were in a watermelon field out near Queen Creek one year. And so you can see by the numbers up there, the efforts to get rid of coyotes and it basically can't be done. In fact, the more pressure put on them to remove animals, they compensate by reproducing at a higher rate. So you just can't get rid of them. Bobcats. Most cats make their lives, living by not being seen, and this is largely true. However, in some urban situations like Scottsdale and particularly that northeast end of the corner of the valley, there's a very robust urban bobcat population, and they lay around on people's lawn furniture. They raise young on their roofs. They drink out of their pools. They catch birds at their bird feeders, and they just walk around like they own the place. And it's not so much that they're uncommon. They've just got used to moving around in that environment, and they've learned not to fear people. And so they do really well in these kind of situations. The upside of it is they don't tend to cause any problems for pets or people. They might eat a bird in your backyard and make a mess, but they're not going to attack your dog or cat. Javelina, on the other hand, can be a big problem, and they are quite common in a variety of urban situations. And I have over the years been in situations where we've moved coyotes from right in the middle of Phoenix, or javelina from right in the middle of Phoenix or highly urbanized areas, and they move in through alleyways or along canals or things like that, and they're quite happy in those situations, but they can be quite a problem. Mountain lions are infrequent visitors to urban areas, but they do occur in them on occasion, much more so down in Tucson, like in that Push Ridge area and Sabino Canyon area. We have issues with mountain lions, but when I was working with the department, there was a female that would move through Fountain Hills on a regular basis, and oftentimes she'd have her cubs with us, and she would move through Fountain Hills, then come across through the McDowell Mountain Park, and then out through the McDowell Sonoran Preserve, and then exit out the north end and onto the forest, and then move back around. And she would do this loop every month or two. We'd get a report of her coming back through. And so they are not common in urban areas, but not rare by any means. When you get to big animals like deer and stuff, you just don't see them, not down here. And so a lot of what you would see in urban areas or urban fringe areas is dictated by where you live. If you live up in Pine Top or Payson or Show Low, then you're going to see mule deer and you're going to see bears and things like that. Down here, we're going to see coyotes, foxes, things like that. So again, where you live has a lot to do with what kind of urban wildlife you're dealing with. And we're talking about mainly Maricopa County here. So lots of bird species are found in urban areas. The trees that we plant in our yards as ornamentals are great attractants for them for nesting. And the department did a research project when I was with them, and looking at what kind of raptors were nesting in urban areas. And peregrine falcons were some of the raptors that nested in the densest urban areas. We had a pair nesting in downtown Phoenix, right in the central part of Phoenix, for several years. And they raised broods, but not very successfully. They only got a few broods off over the time they were there. It was just too hot for the chicks to survive. However, on the fringe areas like Camelback and the McDowell Mountains, there are pairs that regularly raise broods there, again, on the urban fringe, although I don't believe the McDowell Mountain one's been active over the past couple of years. Red-tailed hawks were also very common in urban areas, and they loved any kind of high tree, power line, power pole, sorrows in yards, or on little urban island or little natural islands to raise your chick. Very, very common. After the red tails move out, use the nest for a couple of years, great horned owls often move in right after them and use the nest for several years. And they were very common in urban areas. Smaller owls were also pretty abundant, like screech owls, particularly in the more low density areas. They really like sorrow cavities. Matter of fact, this owl picture was taken in North Scottsdale. This owl was part of a pair that was nesting in a saguaro in a gentleman's yard. Screech owls, same thing. They're certainly more abundant out in wildland, but they're not uncommon in urban areas. And again, cavity nesters, they love those saguaros or hollows in trees. So screech owls eat a variety of vertebrates, and they are so diminutive and so secretive. Oftentimes people have no idea they're even living in their yard. Kestrels were another common cavity nesting bird in urban areas. Again, they really like saguaros, but they were occasionally in sycamores or old cottonwoods or other things that had hollows for them to use. Also, people occasionally put up nest boxes for kestrels and barn owls and other owls, and would have these birds move in. Harris hawks, more common on urban fringes, but occasionally we would see them pretty far interior. Again, wanted big trees or saguaros or some kind of structure that kept them away from predators for building the nest. This is one that was near my house. This pair had its nest in the saguaro. This was right across the street from me. They were starting construction there, and they moved the saguaro several yards to one side. So they picked that thing up and they moved it with a nest in it, and the hawk used it the following year. And so again, long as the habitat's there and it's useful, remains intact, animals are using. Doves, common on porches. I've got one in a potted plant on my back porch right now. So any type of situation they're going to utilize to nest, and they're super common urban birds. As are gamble quail, typically they want a little bit of open space. So in highly urbanized areas, you don't see them. But when you get out in lower density housing, quail are quite common and happy to nest in potted plants or under the shrubs in your yard. Phenopeplas, same type of thing. And this is, these natural areas left along washes. There's a real propensity for landscapers and other people to prune out that mistletoe and get rid of it. And that's, you won't have phenopeplas if you don't have mistletoe. They eat that the fruit of the mistletoe, and they nest in the mistletoe clumps themselves. And so leaving the areas as natural as you can, as unaltered as possible, is the key to a diversity of wildlife. Reptiles are really common, and they do well in urban areas because they oftentimes don't require a lot of space. Tree lizards, a lot of people have these on their back wall running around. They don't need much. Same thing with side blotch lizard. You got a vacant lot, you got a few old boards out there or rocks or down trees or something, they're going to do just fine in a very small area. Whiptails like a little bit more room, but again, don't need a lot. A vacant lot, a green belt, a canal bank, they're going to do just fine. Chuckwallas are going to require more intact habitat, typically with boulders and rocky hillsides with crevices. This is one from South Mountain that's taken right above the city of Phoenix there. Definitely right on the urban fringe there. But the Phoenix Mountain Preserve has chuckwallas in them, as do the McDowells and other places that are largely surrounded by urbanized areas, white tanks. Spiny lizards, happy to be on a big tree in your yard or on a block wall. They're one of the larger backyard lizards that you see. Geckos, again, leave a little bit of natural landscape around, some places for them to hide, get under. They'll do fine, and they're eating spiders and bugs that you don't want in your house. And Gila monsters turn up in some surprising areas in the Phoenix metropolitan area. So they're on Camelback still. They're in the Phoenix Mountain Preserves. I've seen them in Mesa, where there's just a vacant lot that maybe is an acre or two. And, we find them there occasionally. So again, they're able to persist in relatively small areas, as long as the habitat's left relatively intact. Ground snakes are another really common urban snake. You might find them under flower pots in your yard or bricks or paving stones or things like that. They are eating scorpions and spiders, things like that. Great little snakes to have around. Gopher snakes do well in urban areas, but require more space. So this is an animal you're more likely to see on a golf course or big green belt or a big preserve rather than in a small vacant lot. King snakes very much the same as gopher snakes. They're going to want some room to move. Night snakes, on the other hand, a vacant lot's going to please these guys just fine. And these guys are eating lizards and other small snakes, amphibians, and are pretty abundant in some areas. Rattlesnakes are actually fairly common in urban fringe and habitat islands within urban centers. So like the Phoenix Mountain Preserves and whatnot. There was a heritage grant that was done on the Phoenix Mountain Preserves, and they watched the rattlesnakes there. And they found that there were 4 different species of rattlesnakes that were often staying, they were radio tracking them, within feet of heavily used trails. And not only did people not get bit, but hordes of people walked by them without ever noticing they were there. And so these snakes were living in harmony, if you will, with these highly used hiking areas and were causing no issues. I'm sure if the people would have seen them, they would have tried to kill them or whatnot. But again, these animals can persist in really degraded or really heavily compromised habitats oftentimes and do quite well. So amphibians are less commonly served in urban areas, although they can be abundant if you have some kind of water source nearby for them to breed in. So as a kid growing up in Chandler, we had Woodhouse's toads and Great Plains toads, but as all the canals got filled in and covered up, I just watched the toad population slowly decline and slowly snuff out. And in the last years that I lived there, I never saw a toad or even a dead toad on the road. And so they've got to have some place where they can breed and maintain the populations. And if they don't, even though these animals can be fairly long-lived at times, they just eventually blink out. So this is Great Plains toad, and here's the Woodhouse's toad. Great Plains toad's a summer breeder. Woodhouse's is mainly a spring breeder, and using ponds, canals, ditches, golf course ponds, creeks, rivers, or even rain puddles and ephemeral sources of water. Sonoran Desert toads are the one everybody knows. They get big. This is the largest toad that we have in Arizona. They can weigh well over 2 pounds. I've never weighed a 3-pounder, but I think they're out there. I just don't have my scales with me when I happen to see real fat guys like this. These warts you see on them behind the eyes and the big warts you see on the leg, those are poison glands. And all these toads secrete a very strong near toxic poison called bufotein. And if a dog picks it up and tries to mouth it, they'll secrete that toxin, and it can cause paralysis or even kill the dog. And so these things are quite problematic in urban areas at times for pet owners because the dogs need to be trained to be adverse to them. If a dog picks up one of these toads and is mouthing them, they'll start being really developing a real frothy saliva and kind of gagging and spitting. And if you take the garden hose and put it at the back of the mouth and flush forward towards the front of the mouth and just run it out, usually the dog will be fine afterwards. But I've got 4 dogs, and 3 of them stay outside in kennels, and I had to toad proof the kennels, and I've got 9 of these living in a hole off the end of my porch that I watch. And I love having them around, although it was a good effort or a big effort for me to dog proof or toad proof the kennels. It was worth it for the dogs, and it was also worth it to keep the toads around the house. Lots of invertebrates frequent urban areas. We won't go into them because there's a blue million of them, but this is a sphinx moth at a datura flower. If you plant the right plants, you can attract a whole host of different wildlife to your yard and enjoy it. Scorpions, on the other hand, are one that people are less enthused about having them around their house. This is a bark scorpion with young on the back. this is the most commonly seen scorpion in households. And when we look at them, they can be big nuisances at times. Matter of fact, scorpions can be a huge nuisance.
Angel. Give me your gun. Call for help.
So as you can see, firearms are not an effective means of controlling scorpions. Matter of fact, scorpions are resistant to most pesticides, although you can knock the population back if you spray, but then you're killing a lot of other things around the house. So, you know, we don't use pesticides around our place, and we have a scorpion or two in the house every now and then, but that's a small price to pay to have all the other animals we have around our house. So this is a map of scorpion stings in the urban areas. And so the red areas are the really hot areas. So 3,000 to 4,000 people report being stung by scorpions annually in the Phoenix area. Scorpion stings are seldom fatal, but they are often really painful. And so there are zip codes that are scorpion zip codes. And it's one of these deals that you either have scorpions or you don't. And if you don't, you're not likely to start having them all of a sudden, although that does happen occasionally. And so they're most common in proximity to undeveloped areas or low density housing. So one of the things I've learned working with wildlife for 34 years professionally, and I continue to do so since I've been retired, is everybody wants wildlife on their own terms. And everything's a problem for somebody. And I'm no different. I mean, you know, when the rabbits start eating all my native plants, you know, that drives me crazy. And so it would amaze me sometimes about people complaining about different things, birds singing in the trees. I got complaint calls about that, toads calling, you know, all these kind of things, and situations that I would just love to have. People were annoyed, but we all want wildlife on our own terms. They're great if they're no problem, but if they're ugly or scary, or they're eating our plants, or they're making a lot of noise, we don't want them around. So in Maricopa County, this is snake removals in Maricopa County from over a 1 year period. And you can see Western Diamondbacks are way up there. They accounted for more than half of the snake removals in the county. And then you look, you know, and it drops by species down to 7 for sidewinders, another type of rattlesnake. And so when we look at the major nuisance rattlesnakes or snakes in the urban area, two of them are rattlesnakes, speckled rattlesnakes and Western Diamondback rattlesnakes, and then gopher snakes and king snakes. So these are animals that people typically don't want around, but oftentimes they're not really causing any problems. And if a rattlesnake shows up in your yard and you've lived there for 10 years, that rattlesnake has likely been there all that time, and you guys just happened to cross paths during that time. And yet it was no problem for you all those preceding 10 years. But that one Saturday morning you walk out and it's crossing your driveway, all of a sudden it's a problem. So really, you know, if you give things a bit of latitude and a bit of consideration, you can get along with them there. And I do understand that there are times when rattlesnakes need to be removed from properties with small pets or small children. That's only common sense. But a lot of times, we just don't want to tolerate anything that we perceive as a potential problem. So of the the 2,000 plus snake removals in 2018, again, over half were the Western Diamondback. And so it should be noted that when we look at snake bite statistics, most bites are in the United States are given or to people are by Western Diamondback rattlesnakes. And that's not because it's a particularly vicious snake. It's because it's an extremely widespread snake. And also it's a very common snake. And so when we look at snake encounters in the field, us biologists, we compare notes, we find that we encounter Western diamondback rattlesnakes twice as often as any other snake in the field. So does that mean they're the most abundant snake? No, but it means the way they move and they behave, you're more likely to encounter them than other snakes. So again, it's no surprise that these would be the most common snake removals in urban and urban fringe situations. So when we look at mammals, we can see that when we look at the top four complaints by about mammals in urban areas, we have coyotes, javelinas, bobcats, and mountain lions in the Phoenix metropolitan area. And you look at the number of complaints, wildlife complaints over the years, and you can see there at the bottom there, in 2019 there were 1913, or 2022 there were 1913 complaints. And so the number of complaint calls has actually remained pretty static over the period of time, despite the number of the population going up. So coyotes are the number one complaint animal, and it ranges from I saw a coyote on my street to a coyote ate my chihuahua. And so they do really well in these urban situations that we talked about. They're readily exploited in any situation. You can avoid conflicts by not leaving your dog food out and accompanying your small pets in areas with coyotes when you take them out at night to relieve themselves. Just don't leave those small pets alone. It all boils down to responsible pet ownership. Don't take any chances. This lady in the upper right-hand corner was bit by a coyote in the face. And a lot of these problems are a matter of just common sense. So there was a coyote hit on the road and she decided she was going to take it to the vet.
Oh.
So she reached down to pick it up and put it in her car, and it bit her on the face. This poor boy here on the lower right-hand corner, this was a child that was in a crib, and there was a place at a park where people were feeding coyotes, and a coyote came up and nipped him. And so don't feed these animals. Don't do anything to encourage them. Remove attractants, watch your pets. And that really goes a long way to limiting conflicts with coyotes. Black bears are rare in urban areas, but we get a black bear in the Phoenix area on an average about every 2.5 years. And in the early 2000s, we had a severe drought year, and I spent a good part of my summer from late July through September chasing black bears in the Phoenix area. We had 13 end up in the Phoenix area. Many of them were cubs like this that were basically just abandoned by their mother, kicked out. And these were starving cubs that were looking for anything, and they wandered down from the mountains into the Phoenix area. We do get adult bears into the urban area every now and then, but they only account for less than 1% of the complaint calls that we get in urban areas regarding wildlife. Javelina are right up there, like number 2 on the list of nuisance wildlife. This is actually my garage, where I left the garage door open one night, and I heard a noise and walked out there, and they had gotten into the birdseed bucket. And I walked out, and they just kind of looked at me like, what? You know, not intimidated at all. And that's pretty typical of urban javelinas. So again, like coyotes, it's incumbent on you to remove the nuisances. This was a bonehead move on my part. I just, all I had to do was make sure that garage door was closed, and I just neglected to do so. And so whatever you can do to minimize conflicts. Javelina can be a huge problem with pet dogs. And when we see bites to people, invariably it's people walking their dogs and they run into a herd of javelina. The javelina attack the dog. Javelinas absolutely hate dogs. And the people reach down to pick up the dog to protect it, and they get bitten. And so watch for javelina if you're out walking. Make sure you avoid them at all costs, and keep your pet contained, or keep a leash on it, keep control of it, and keep it away from these javelina, because they will literally tear that dog apart. So this is something, if you got your sound on, turn it up. These were javelinas we removed from an urban area. They're guarded. and asleep, and you can hear them snoring. So these urban javelina, we end up removing them all the time. And they can be a huge problem in people's yards, eating their landscape, attacking, their dogs and things like that. So darting them like this kind of situation, then moving them out to areas. Often we take them up to Southwest Wildlife, where Linda Searles incorporates them into a herd. She's got a really clever way of doing that. And then we use that herd to reintroduce them to areas where javelina have disappeared or are not, populations are not doing well. So another urban situation here is the introduction of exotic animals. Peach-faced lovebirds are one that probably many of you have seen in your yard or in urban areas. They don't seem to be causing a problem, but they do like to use saguaros as nesting cavities in saguaros. They like to use those, and they edge out other native birds that would use those, things like flickers or owls or kestrels or things like that. But they don't seem to be moving into the wildland, so we're not overly concerned about those. This is one of the latest introductions. This is a white-spotted wall gecko from Northern Africa in the Middle Eastern area of the world. These have now become incredibly abundant in the Phoenix area, and particularly on Camelback Mountain. And this lizard will eventually move throughout the urban area. We've already got reports over in Mesa of it, and into the surrounding mountain ranges, where it's going to compete with native wildlife, native lizards, and probably prey on many of them. And we don't have any idea of what the impacts of this lizard are going to be on our native reptile population. But we're actually terrified of the potential impacts. It could be devastating to some species. And these are all basically animals that were released pets or escaped pets. And so, if you're going to have a pet, it is against the law to let it go ever. And so if you don't want it, give it to somebody, or even euthanize it. I know that sounds terrible. Don't dump it in a lake. Don't dump it in a golf course pond. Do not release it in your yard or any place else, because these animals can be killing the animals that belong here or competing with them, and can be highly detrimental. So we need to keep tabs on all these things. This is actually the habitat of that white-spotted wall gecko on the edge of Camelback Mountain, and you can see the big urban center there. We did a survey last spring. We counted 65 of them in about an hour and a half on Camelback Mountain. And most of them we couldn't even get to. They were way up on cliff faces and stuff. But every one of these houses that you can see in this picture is a potential home for this animal, as are the natural areas that are adjacent to them. So the spread of this animal throughout this Phoenix metropolitan area and the adjacent wildlands is basically, as long as there's rocky mountain areas, they are going to do fine, and they're going to move into them. So I guess the message is lots of cool things can inhabit our urban areas with us, and we can enhance our enjoyment with these species by landscaping and providing areas for these animals to visit, live, and feed. But we must do so prudently to not attract the wrong kind of animals that could create a pest or a health risk to our neighbors. Any questions?
Randy, how about if we take our 10-minute bio break and people can add their questions to the chat and we can address them after that? Would that work for you?
Work just fine.
Okay, so everybody, you were mapping bats?
I was, we were netting bats and then photographing them, documenting them for, research and stuff. So there was a team of researchers there that were working on various things like energetic use and sugar consumption and all that thing with bats. So there was one young lady that would actually, when we caught the bat, she would fly him on a tether. She'd feed him, fly him on a tether, and then release him. And they would she'd fly him around for 10 or 15 minutes, and then she would measure, put them in a special container, collect the oxygen, and then they could analyze that to see how much of that sugar it was burning, the food they gave them, actually. And
Wow.
so energetic stuff. So there's a lot of different projects, and we were helping out on that, and then also dovetailing on that with the photography stuff.
Interesting. Well, I think we are ready to resume. So there were a couple questions in the chat. Dave, do you mind monitoring the chat and asking those questions?
Can do. All right. First one from Brad. Is the wall gecko a different species than the Sri Lankan gecko or the Mediterranean gecko?
Yeah, so that Mediterranean gecko is a different animal, and it's been around since about 1972-ish or so, and it was first reported from Tucson, then later in the Phoenix area. And the good thing about that gecko was it never left anthropogenic structure. So we never found it out in the wilds. It was always associated with man-made buildings. This thing loves buildings, but it's happy to be out in the wilds on rock faces and boulders and all kinds of stuff like that. So that's where we're really worried about it.
Okay. And from Amir, he asks, could you elaborate on any wildlife passage projects that you thought were very important or interesting, and the role of engineers, Department of Transportation, environmental scientists, game and fish, etc., and the future of this work?
Yeah, so those two I highlighted the elk and the bighorn sheep one have been very successful. I think I almost called them wildly successful. I'm not quite sure I could go that far, but they've been far more successful than we ever imagined. When and I say we is kind of a royal we. I still think of myself as game and fish, but I've been retired for several years, so it's kind of hard to get out of that habit after all those decades. So it was far more successful than ever it would imagine they would be, and I think they're excellent models on a national level. And it did take a variety of folks. I mean, game and fish folks couldn't have built that bridge if you had held a gun to their head, because they're not engineers. And Department of Transportation folks are very interested in doing minimize. So Game and Fish Department is concerned about the wildlife and people, and Department of Transportation is concerned about moving people safely and effectively from one point to another. So this was a great team up, because you had these collisions with wildlife, and big wildlife. I mean, nobody wants to hit something the size of a bighorn sheep or deer or an elk. And so it was kind of a marriage made in heaven for a big universal problem. I hope that answered the question.
Yeah, I'd like to add to that just a little bit, Randy. In my class, I show it's about an 8-minute video, and it must be one of Arizona Wildlife News segments, all about the Nevada people, when they were building a highway, learned about the work that had been done by Arizona Game and Fish. So they imported people from Arizona Game and Fish to help them design the wildlife overpasses on that stretch of a major interstate. It was pretty successful. And then Norris Dodd, who did that work for Game and Fish for a number of years, who retired probably about the same time you did or a little before, he's been hired by, they consider themselves the happiest nation on earth. Begins with a B.
Bhutan.
Bhutan, thank you. Bhutan learned about his work and hired him to come over to their country to do some similar planning for wildlife overpasses. So I think there is a bright future in that. Amir happens to be a relatively new person to Arizona, and he's in the environmental engineering kinds of things. So that might be a career path for you, Amir. Something to check out, I would say.
Yeah, so the overpasses, again, are just one way of moving wildlife. And so there's some projects back east where they've got culverts for toad crossings and salamander crossings and snake crossings in the spring when these things wake up from hibernation and move to these breeding areas. So if you're interested in something like that, all you got to do is a little bit of searching online, and you're going to find a ton of different projects trying to move turtles. I mean, things from as small as salamanders to moose from one side of a road to another.
Okay, Dave, are there any other questions?
That is all.
Okay,
All right.
so Randy, what is your next project?
I'm working on a key to the larval amphibians of Arizona, and I've been at it for 3 years now. So, well, this is the third year. So that's going to consume most of this summer, and I hope to get that behind me. So, but yeah, that's going to be, I mean, I know all of you will read it, probably have it on the bedside table there. I mean, so anyway, the 3 people that'll actually use it will be pretty useful, but I don't think it's going to be, wildly popular.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to ask you this question. In all the years you were at Game and Fish and you dealt with a lot of urban wildlife issues, is there one or are there 2 that really come to the top of your mind when you think about this and you want to shake your head and say, how can people even think that or do that?
Yeah, there was a coyote over in Phoenix near a golf course that a family, or a man and a woman, I should say, were buying chickens from like bashes and feeding them, and that resulted in a bite. And then there was another one in Mesa where a guy was feeding coyotes and then leased his house out, and the people that leased it didn't know that was a problem, or a thing. And so the gentleman that was leasing it came home from buying groceries, and he brought his toddler in under one arm and a bag of groceries under, left the door open because there were more groceries to get, set the child on the floor, the groceries on the counter, and turned around, and a coyote was dragging the toddler out the door. And I don't think the coyote would have eaten it, but it was, a potentially a big problem. And so there's things like that, that you think about, that people, solely human caused. And there were a lot of situations like that with javelina and other things. And so, yeah, it's almost always somebody does something and they're not the person that suffers. It's the guy next door that gets bit or something like that.
Reminds me of when Gary Matai's comment, the current generation is not the one, something along the lines of the current generation is not the one to see the damage we're doing to the environment. And that's the problem. So,
yeah.
Okay, any other, go ahead, Randy.
No, people love wildlife and they love to see it. So they try to do things that get it to hang around, but they're not thinking about anything beyond their immediate desires.
Any other parting words of wisdom for us?
None.
Okay. Okay. Thank you so very much for giving up your evening tonight. Great presentation as usual. And we'll be in touch for the next one next year.
Okay. Thank you, everybody. Take care.
Take care, Randy.